The Habsburgs did not disappear when Austria-Hungary did. They lost the throne, the machinery of empire, access to dynastic property, and even the right to live freely in the country their family had ruled for centuries. Within months, the last emperor was on a train into exile. Within a few years, he was dead on a distant Atlantic island. Yet the family itself survived, spread across Europe and North America, and eventually returned to public life in a form almost no one in 1918 could have imagined. The real question is not simply how the Habsburg Empire ended. It is what happened to the people who were left carrying its name after the state vanished beneath them. To understand the scale of that reversal, only a little rewind is necessary. By the time Emperor Karl came to the throne in 1916, the Habsburg dynasty was already ancient by modern political standards. For centuries, members of the family had ruled a shifting collection of territories across Central Europe. They had produced Holy Roman emperors, kings of Hungary and Bohemia, rulers of Austria, and one of the most recognizable royal houses in European history. By the 19th century, their power was centered on the Austrian Empire, and after the Compromise of 1867, on the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. This was not a single nation in the modern sense. It was a vast political structure containing Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Croats, Slovenes, Romanians, Italians, Ukrainians, Serbs, and others. Vienna was one imperial center. Budapest was another. The dynasty sat above a complicated system of parliaments, ministries, crown lands, armies, aristocratic networks, and inherited loyalties. The old Emperor Franz Joseph had become the human symbol of that order. He had ruled since 1848. By the time he died in November 1916, many of his subjects had never known another monarch. Karl inherited all of this in the middle of disaster. He was only 29. The First World War had already consumed enormous numbers of lives. Food shortages were worsening. National movements inside the monarchy were becoming harder to contain. Austria-Hungary depended increasingly on Germany, while the military situation deteriorated. Karl tried to find a way out of the war. His government also experimented with political reforms. But he had inherited a crisis too large to solve through good intentions alone. By the autumn of 1918, the empire was coming apart faster than Vienna could control it. National councils formed. Czechoslovakia declared independence. South Slav lands broke away. Hungary ended the political union with Austria. Soldiers returned from the front to societies exhausted by hunger, inflation, and grief. Karl was still emperor in title, but the state beneath that title was disappearing. On November 11, 1918, he signed a declaration in which he renounced participation in Austrian state affairs. The wording mattered. Karl did not formally abdicate. He believed monarchy carried obligations that could not simply be surrendered like an ordinary political office. The next day, German Austria was proclaimed a republic. That difference between stepping away from government and formally abandoning the crown would shape almost everything that happened next. Karl and his wife, Empress Zita, left Vienna and moved with their children to Eckartsau, a hunting lodge east of the capital. Think about the symbolism of that move. Only days earlier, the Habsburg court had occupied the ceremonial center of an empire. Now the former imperial family was living in a country that no longer accepted the political world they represented. Eckartsau became a waiting room between monarchy and exile. Karl hoped the situation might still change. Austria's new leaders feared exactly that. The republic was fragile. The economy was shattered. Revolutionary politics had spread across Europe. In neighboring Hungary, events were becoming even more unstable. The question was no longer whether Karl still possessed the old imperial authority. He did not. The question was whether the new republic could safely allow a former emperor, who still refused to admit that his throne had legally ceased to exist, to remain inside the country. In March 1919, the answer became clear. Arrangements were made for Karl, Zita, and their children to leave Austria for Switzerland. On March 23rd, the family boarded a train at Eckartsau and began the journey west. But Karl did something before he was fully gone that hardened the Republic's attitude toward him. Near the Swiss border, he issued what became known as the Feldkirch Manifesto. In it, he challenged the validity of the declarations by which he had withdrawn from state affairs and maintained that his removal had not been legitimate. For Karl, this was a defense of dynastic principle. For the Austrian Republic, it looked like proof that the monarchy was not politically dead simply because the emperor had crossed the border. Only days later, on April 3, 1919, Austria passed the law that would define the Habsburg family's relationship with the new state for generations. The Habsburg law did two things that mattered enormously. First, it expelled members of the former ruling house unless they renounced dynastic claims and accepted the republic as private citizens. Second, it transferred important categories of Habsburg property to the state. That second point is more complicated than the simple phrase, "The government took everything." It did not. The Habsburgs had possessed different kinds of property. Some assets were clearly connected to the crown and to the functioning of the ruling house. Some belonged to family funds created to support members of the dynasty. Other assets were private property in a more ordinary sense. The new republic treated these categories differently. Property associated with the former court and the dynasty's tide funds passed to the state. Significant private holdings remained with individual family members. That distinction would become a source of argument for decades, because the line between dynastic and private was not merely financial. It represented two completely different interpretations of what the Habsburg family had been. To the Republic, certain palaces, collections, and funds had existed because the Habsburgs were the state. When the dynasty lost sovereignty, those assets belonged to the public order that replaced them. To members of the family, at least some of those same assets were inherited family property that had accumulated across generations. That disagreement never entirely vanished. The new republic also struck at the social language of the old order. In the same revolutionary spring, Austria abolished legal nobility and aristocratic titles. That meant the change was not limited to who sat in the Hofburg. The legal vocabulary of rank itself was being dismantled. For generations, a Habsburg name had carried an official place inside a hierarchy. Archduke was not merely decorative. It marked membership in the ruling house and placed a person inside a system of succession, court precedence, and public privilege. Republican Austria was saying that none of that had legal force anymore. This is why the family's post-imperial story became more than exile. It was a forced conversion from dynasty into private citizenship. A member of the family could still remember an emperor as a father or grandfather. Relatives could still use traditional forms socially outside Austria. Monarchists could still speak of archdukes and imperial heirs. But the Austrian state no longer recognized those ranks as public identities. The family had lost a government, but it had also lost the legal framework that had told everyone what a Habsburg was. That would become one of the deepest challenges of the next century. How do you preserve a dynastic identity when the law insists that, politically, you are simply another citizen? But in 1919, Karl had a more immediate problem. He was a ruler without a country. Switzerland agreed to receive the former imperial family, but the arrangement came with restrictions. Karl and Zita first stayed near Lake Constance, then moved farther west to the area around Lake Geneva. A small court in exile formed around them. There were aides, family supporters, a governess for the children, clerical figures, and loyal aristocrats. It looked, in miniature, like the remains of monarchy trying to preserve its habits after the government that had supported those habits ceased to exist. Karl still did not believe the story was finished, and Hungary gave him a reason to hope. After the collapse of Austria-Hungary, Hungary went through revolution, a short-lived Soviet republic, counter-revolution, and political violence. By 1920, it had adopted one of the strangest constitutional arrangements in Europe. Hungary was officially a kingdom, simply had no king. Admiral Miklós Horthy, a former officer of the Austro-Hungarian Navy, became regent. The title suggested temporary guardianship of the monarchy. Yet Horthy increasingly had reasons to preserve the system as it was rather than return power to Karl. Karl saw the situation very differently. He had been crowned King of Hungary in 1916. In his mind, he had never lawfully ceased to be king. If Austria would not take him back, perhaps Hungary would. This became the most dangerous chapter of the family's immediate aftermath. In March 1921, Karl secretly left Switzerland. He crossed borders without a valid ordinary passport, traveled through Austria, and made his way toward Hungary. Even some of the people closest to the old royalist network were surprised by the attempt. Karl reached Budapest and met Horthy. Imagine the scene. One man considered himself the lawful king. The other was governing a kingdom in the king's absence. But Horthy refused to hand over power. He argued that restoring Karl could provoke war. Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Yugoslavia had formed what became known as the Little Entente, and those states were deeply opposed to a Habsburg restoration. They feared that the dynasty's return could reopen borders, territorial claims, and the political order that had existed before 1918. Karl had expected loyalty to the crown to overcome those dangers. It did not. He returned to Western Hungary, fell ill, and eventually went back to Switzerland. At that point, a cautious former monarch might have accepted that restoration was impossible. Karl tried again. The second attempt, in October 1921, became the closest the Habsburgs ever came to reversing the result of the imperial collapse. This time Zita went with him. Karl and Zita flew from Switzerland to Hungary. The plan depended on surprise, loyal troops, and a rapid movement toward Budapest. But the mobilization did not unfold as expected. A crucial message to supporters apparently failed to arrive in time. That delay gave Karl's opponents space to react. Still, the attempt did not immediately collapse. In Schoenbrunn, the former emperor and empress were greeted by supporters. Soldiers joined them. A counter-government was assembled. Roughly 2,000 troops accompanied the royal party as it moved toward the capital by train. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible. Units along the route swore loyalty. The train continued east. Karl, who 3 years earlier had watched his empire disintegrate, was moving toward Budapest behind armed men who still called him king. Then the train stopped near the capital. Horthy's forces had organized resistance. Confusion spread. Accounts of the confrontation differ in important details, but fighting broke out and people were killed. Karl now faced the choice that defined the end of his restoration attempt. Push forward and risk a civil war. Or stop. He capitulated. The crown was lost again, this time not through the collapse of an entire empire but through a failed attempt to reclaim one of its former kingdoms. Karl and Zita were detained at the Benedictine monastery of Tyhany on Lake Balaton. Karl still refused to sign a formal abdication. The European powers had seen enough. The former emperor could no longer remain near the states he still hoped to rule. A British warship, HMS Cardiff, carried Karl and Zita away from continental Europe. Their destination was not another royal court. It was Madeira, a Portuguese island far out in the Atlantic. This was exile in a much more final form. At first, the family stayed at an expensive hotel in Funchal. But money was becoming a serious problem. The image of the Habsburgs after 1918 is often distorted by the scale of what they had once controlled. People imagine that a dynasty associated with palaces, imperial jewels, and centuries of inheritance must have remained effortlessly rich. The reality was more complicated. Karl had not left Austria empty-handed. Private furniture, works of art, and other possessions had gone with the family. But political exile was expensive. The restoration attempts cost money. Assets could not always be accessed easily. Expected financial support from the former territories of the monarchy did not materialize in a reliable form. The family had to reduce expenses. They moved to the Villa Quinta do Monte in the hills above Funchal, a residence offered to them by a local banking family. Then Karl became seriously ill. He was only 34 when the illness began to take hold. His health declined rapidly. Zita was pregnant with their 8th child. The man who had ruled a great European monarchy less than 4 years earlier was now sick in a borrowed villa on a distant island. On April 1, 1922, Karl died. He was 35. His funeral was modest. His body was buried in the church of Nossa Senhora do Monte above Funchal. This could have been the end of the Habsburg political story. Instead, it created a new protagonist. Karl left behind 7 living children, with an 8th still unborn. His eldest son, Otto, was 9 years old. Zita was now a widow in her 20s with a large family, no throne, no secure homeland, and a political cause she refused to abandon. Her response was not to dissolve quietly into private life. She reorganized the dynasty around her children. With help from the Spanish royal family and other supporters, Zita brought the family back to mainland Europe. They settled for a time in the Basque country of Spain, where they lived in a large residence at Lequeitio. Later, they moved to Belgium so Otto could study at the Catholic University of Leuven. The family still maintained some of the habits of a court in exile. Supporters visited. Dynastic traditions were preserved. The children were educated with a strong awareness of their ancestry. Zita treated Otto not simply as her eldest son, but as the heir to a political inheritance she believed had been unjustly interrupted. When Otto reached adulthood in 1930, the family regarded him as head of the dynasty. But the world around him was changing again. The Habsburgs now faced a threat very different from Republican Austria: Nazism. Otto became an outspoken opponent of Adolf Hitler and of the idea that Austria should disappear into Nazi Germany. During the 1930s, he supported Austrian independence and at points offered himself as a possible political figure who might help resist German expansion. This was a remarkable reversal. The son of the last emperor had once been treated by the Austrian Republic as a threat to its political order. Now he presented himself as a defender of Austria's continued existence against a much more dangerous form of political absorption. His relationship with the authoritarian Austrian government before the Anschluss was not simple. Otto was a monarchist. He was close to conservative Catholic networks. Some of the political systems he dealt with were themselves undemocratic. His later reputation as a European statesman should not erase those complications. But on one point he was clear. He opposed Hitler. When Nazi Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, the possibility of a Habsburg restoration collapsed instantly. The Nazi regime regarded Otto as an enemy. Family property that had been restored under Austria's authoritarian government in the 1930s was once again seized after the Anschluss. The dynasty had now been dispossessed twice under two different political systems for different reasons. The property question also passed through one more extraordinary cycle before the Second World War. During the Austrian authoritarian regime of the 1930s, the political climate became more favorable to the former dynasty. In 1935, the banishment provisions were relaxed and steps began to return some previously confiscated Habsburg property. For supporters of the family, it looked as though history might be bending back toward them. Then came the Anschluss. After Nazi Germany absorbed Austria in March 1938, the restitution measures were reversed and the property was seized again. The Habsburgs were not being punished this time for threatening a republic. They were being targeted by a dictatorship that regarded Otto's anti-Nazi politics and the symbolism of an independent Austrian dynasty as dangerous. After the war, Austria faced an unusual legal problem. Which version of the property story should survive? The Republican confiscation of 1919? The partial restoration of the 1930s? Or the Nazi seizure after 1938? The post-war settlement did not simply treat the family's losses under the Nazis as though everything taken in 1938 had unquestionably belonged to them before that moment. Instead, the restored republic returned to the legal foundation of the First Republic. That meant the older distinction between private property and dynastic or tied property remained central. This is one reason later Habsburg restitution claims became so complicated. A person could be a victim of Nazi confiscation and still fail to prove that the property at issue had legally belonged to the family under the Republican settlement that came before the Nazis. The argument was not only about who took the property. It was about who owned it on the day before it was taken. And soon the family had to run again. In May 1940, German forces invaded Belgium. Zita, Otto, and the younger Habsburg children were in immediate danger. They escaped through France. After France fell, members of the family moved through Spain and Portugal toward North America. Otto spent much of the war in the United States. Zita eventually lived in Quebec with some of the younger children, partly so they could continue their education in French. This was the family that had once ruled from Vienna, Prague, and Budapest. Now its members were refugees and exiles scattered across the Atlantic world. But exile changed what the Habsburg name meant. Karl had spent his final years trying to regain a crown. Otto gradually moved toward a different idea of political purpose. He worked for Austrian independence, for a post-war European order, and later for European integration. He became associated with the pan-European movement, which argued that Europe's states needed deeper cooperation if the continent was to escape the cycle of nationalism and war. The shift was profound. The Habsburg dynasty had once held different peoples together under one monarch. Otto increasingly supported a Europe in which different nations remained politically distinct but cooperated through institutions. It was not an empire restored. It was almost the opposite. But first he had to solve a much more personal problem. Could he even go home? After the Second World War, Austria restored its republican constitutional order. The Habsburg law returned with it. The post-war state did not simply forget the legal settlement of 1919. The settlement also gained an international layer in 1955, when Austria regained full sovereignty through the State Treaty. The post-war order did not reopen the Habsburg restoration question. Instead, the Republic's legal break with the dynasty was preserved. By then, the practical danger of an emperor returning with an army was remote, but the law still carried symbolic force. It declared that the democratic state, not hereditary succession, was the source of political authority in modern Austria. For Otto, that meant the condition imposed on his family still mattered. If he wanted to return to Austria, he had to renounce claims connected to the former ruling house and recognize himself as a loyal citizen of the Republic. This was emotionally and politically difficult. His father had died, refusing to accept that he had been lawfully deposed. His mother still defended dynastic legitimacy. Monarchists continued to treat Otto as the rightful heir. But Otto also wanted access to the country of his birth. In 1961, he made the decisive declaration. He renounced membership in the ruling house in the political sense required by Austrian law, gave up claims to rule, and declared loyalty to the Republic. You might expect that to have ended the issue. It did not. Instead, Austria entered what became known as the Habsburg crisis. The government itself divided over whether Otto's declaration was sufficient. The dispute moved through Austria's highest legal institutions. In May 1963, the administrative court concluded that Otto's declaration met the legal requirement and that his exclusion from the country should be lifted. That judgment did not calm the politics. It intensified them. For Austrian conservatives, Otto's return could be treated as a matter of law and civil rights. For many social democrats, the Habsburg name still carried the memory of inherited privilege, anti-republican politics, and the unresolved battles of Austria's First Republic. Parliamentary debates became fierce. The dispute raised questions far larger than one man's passport. Who had the final word when parliament, government, and courts disagreed? Could the Republic trust the grandson of Franz Joseph's world? Was the dynasty a private family now, or still a political symbol? Took years to settle. In 1966, Otto finally received a passport that allowed him to enter Austria. In October of that year, he returned for the first time in nearly half a century. There were protests. That matters because it shows how slowly dynasties die in public memory. By the 1960s, no serious Habsburg army was waiting at the border. No restoration government was preparing to march into Vienna. The monarchy was not about to return. Yet the arrival of one former crown prince could still trigger mass political emotion. The old empire was gone. Its argument with the Republic was not. Eventually, even that conflict softened. In 1972, Socialist Chancellor Bruno Kreisky and Otto publicly shook hands. The gesture symbolized a reconciliation that would have seemed extraordinary during the political battles of the previous decade. A second symbolic return followed through Zita. The former empress had never signed the same kind of renunciation Otto had. For years, that prevented her from entering Austria. Later legal interpretation concluded that because Zita had married into the dynasty rather than being born into the line of succession, the restriction did not apply to her in the same way. In 1982, after more than 6 decades away, Zita returned to Austria. She was an old woman by then. Think about what she had lived through. She had been empress during the First World War. She had watched the monarchy collapse, followed her husband into exile, joined him in an attempt to regain Hungary, buried him on Madeira, raised 8 children across several countries, escaped the Nazis, crossed the Atlantic, and spent decades defending the memory of a political order that no longer existed. Now she could enter the republic that had once expelled her family. When Zita died in 1989, her funeral took place in Vienna. She was buried in the imperial crypt, the traditional burial place of the Habsburg dynasty. The republic had not restored her crown. It had restored something else: the ability to belong to Austrian history without ruling Austria. Otto's transformation went even further. He married Regina of Saxe-Meiningen in 1951, and they had 7 children. He settled in Bavaria and built a political career around European integration. From 1979 to 1999, Otto served in the directly elected European Parliament as a representative of Bavaria's Christian Social Union. The last Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary became an elected parliamentarian. There may be no better single image of what happened to the Habsburg family after the empire fell. His public life was not free of controversy. He remained a conservative Catholic figure. Some of his historical judgments drew criticism. His political relationships and comments could be divisive. But his central cause was no longer the restoration of his father's throne. It was Europe. In August 1989, Otto was connected with the Pan-European picnic on the Austrian-Hungarian border, an event that helped expose the weakness of the Iron Curtain when hundreds of East Germans crossed from Hungary into Austria. There is a strange historical symmetry here. The Habsburg monarchy had collapsed partly because the national and political forces of Central Europe could no longer be contained inside its imperial structure. 7 decades later, the dynasty's most prominent heir was supporting a Europe where borders between democratic states would become less dangerous and less absolute. Otto died in July 2011 at the age of 98. There was also one final transformation in the memory of Karl himself. In October 2004, Pope John Paul II beatified the last emperor in Rome. For Catholics who admired Karl, the ceremony emphasized his personal faith and his efforts to seek peace during the First World War. For critics and historians, Karl's political record remained open to debate, as the record of any ruler should. But the ceremony revealed how far his public identity had traveled. In 1918, Karl had been the defeated head of a collapsing monarchy. In 1921, European governments treated him as a destabilizing claimant who might drag Central Europe back into conflict. By the early 21st century, he was being remembered in a religious ceremony attended by descendants of the same family that had once been excluded from Austria. His body still remained on Madeira, far from the capital he had ruled. That physical separation is important. The Habsburgs recovered public visibility. They recovered access to Austria. They recovered a place in national memory. They did not reverse exile retroactively. Karl never returned. The last emperor's grave remained on the Atlantic island where political Europe had sent him. His funeral in Vienna drew large crowds. He was buried in the imperial crypt. In accordance with Habsburg tradition, his heart was interred separately at the Benedictine Abbey of Pannonhalma in Hungary. Again, there was no restoration. No crown was placed on his head. But the family had moved from being legally excluded from Austria to being publicly woven back into its historical memory. That still leaves the question many viewers naturally ask. What happened to the money, the palaces, and the family itself? The answer is less glamorous than the mythology. There is no surviving Habsburg Empire fortune sitting intact in one family account. The property settlement after 1918 broke the old connection between dynasty and state. Palaces and assets tied to the crown or dynastic funds became public property. Major imperial spaces such as the Hofburg and Schoenbrunn belonged to the world of the Austrian state, public institutions and heritage tourism, not to a reigning Habsburg household. Private property was a separate matter, and different branches of the extended family continued to possess or inherit private assets. Some Habsburg descendants have owned estates, castles, art or other property through ordinary family inheritance. But that is very different from possessing the economic base of the former monarchy. The disputed category has always been the property that sat between the two worlds. Was it truly family property? Or was it property held by the dynasty because the dynasty was sovereign? Austria's 1919 settlement answered that question in favor of the Republic. Later governments briefly changed parts of the arrangement, the Nazis reversed those changes, and after the Second World War the Republic restored the earlier legal order. Members of the Habsburg family later challenged aspects of the property settlement and tried to connect their claims to compensation rules for property taken by the Nazi regime. But the central Republican settlement survived. That is why a visitor can walk through rooms associated with Habsburg emperors without entering a private royal palace. The architecture remained. The sovereignty did not. And the family title changed too. Austria abolished legal nobility after the monarchy fell. In modern Austrian law, archduke is not a state-recognized rank. Members of the family may be described by traditional dynastic titles in historical, social, or ceremonial settings, but those titles do not carry public authority. Today, the head of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine is Karl Habsburg Lothringen, Otto's eldest son. He is the grandson of the last emperor. He has been active in politics, cultural heritage work, and international organizations, and he once served as a member of the European Parliament. But he is not Emperor of Austria. There is no Austrian throne waiting for him. His position as head of the house is a family and dynastic role, not a constitutional office. The contrast becomes even sharper in the next generation. Karl's son Ferdinand Habsburg is a professional racing driver. In 2026, he competes in the FIA World Endurance Championship with Alpine in the hypercar class. A century ago, the eldest sons of this family were educated for court, command, and dynastic duty. Today, one of the most visible younger Habsburgs wears a racing suit and competes at international circuits. That does not mean the past has vanished. The family still maintains traditions, historical memory, and dynastic institutions. The Habsburg name continues to carry extraordinary cultural weight across Austria, Hungary, the Czech lands, Croatia, and the rest of Central Europe. Some descendants remain active in public life. The imperial crypt still receives Habsburg burials. Family history is preserved through archives, museums, foundations, churches, private collections, and public scholarship. But the meaning of survival changed. Karl, the last emperor, tried to survive politically by recovering a throne. Zita tried to survive dynastically by raising the next generation as heirs. Otto survived by redefining inherited identity inside democratic Europe. The generations after him have gone further still. For them, Habsburg is a surname, a historical inheritance, a family network, and sometimes a ceremonial tradition. It is no longer a government. That may be the most important answer to what happened after the empire fell. The dynasty was not destroyed. It was separated from power. And that separation happened in stages. First came the collapse of the state, then exile, then confiscation and legal exclusion, then failed restoration, then the death of the last emperor, then decades in which the family still behaved as though history might reverse itself. And finally, slowly came adaptation. The most revealing image is not a coronation or a battle. It is a return. Picture Zita as an elderly woman entering Austria in 1982, more than 60 years after the empire disappeared. The country around her was a stable republic. The imperial offices were government buildings and museums. Her husband's throne had become history. Her son had renounced political claims and built a career in democratic Europe. Nothing she had fought to restore had been restored. And yet she was home. That is the paradox of the Habsburg story after 1918. They lost almost everything that had made them a ruling dynasty, but the name itself survived the loss. In the end, the family found a place in the countries that replaced its empire not by defeating the republics, but by outliving the conflict with them. The crowns disappeared. The family remained. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the Habsburg collapse. Political power can vanish in a season, while identity takes generations to learn how to live without it. If you could choose the next fallen dynasty for us to follow into exile, survival, and the modern world, which family should it be?